After Manchester's first major land-based pirate station, Radio Aquarius, came to an end in 1975, everyone involved went their separate ways. Andy and Bob went on to form Andromeda, and it was many years later that Aquarius's founder Charlie Turner began to set his sights on a new station, KFM. If you want to watch the series on Radio Aquarius, then the link is in the description below. I also made a documentary about Andromeda Independent Radio, which you'll find there too. By 1983, Charlie was watching the activities and relative success of stations such as Radio Jackie South, and put a plan into action to set up his new venture. He started building equipment such as a professional high-grade audio console and collecting the other bits and pieces needed to set up a station. He got hold of a 50-watt main transmitter, a stereo encoder and a wooden Douglas UHF transmitter and receiver for the studio to main transmitter link, and in February 1984, along with a couple of lads who had some involvement with Aquarius, he set up Stockport's KFM. The studio was located in this room above the door of Rayner House, an office building on Higher Hillgate in Stockport. Here, Charlie and the others put together a good quality pair of ex-BBC turntables and built a console. The main transmitter was on a hill at Bowstones near Disley. There was a low-powered UHF link transmitter and antenna mounted in the roof space at Rayner House, which pointed over towards Bowstones, a familiar location for Charlie, and more specifically on a farm next to Lantern Wood, which is where DTI area boss Gordon Yates the pirate hunter and his men raided Aquarius a few years earlier. This link between Rayner House and Bowstones separated the studio from the transmitter site and made it harder for the DTI to track the pirates themselves. If they located the transmitter site and took it off the air, the studio itself was safe a few miles away. The site at Bowstones during this time, as it still is today, was home to amateur radio repeaters, police communications equipment and other utility radio systems. It has great takeoff across the whole of Manchester and most of Stockport, and had been a successful location for earlier stations. They knocked on the door and asked the site keeper if they could put a PMR repeater up there, and he agreed without much questioning, not realising that it was in fact a pirate radio transmitter and antenna. The studio was set up, the UHF link from Rayner House was in place, and the transmitter and antenna were up at Bowstones. KFM was on the air. At this time it was just Charlie, the two Petes who were involved in Aquarius, and a lad called Alistair, so they decided to put the feelers out for some help.
Hello, you're listening to, well, what are you listening to? You're one of 1 million or so people in the South Manchester area. Have you ever considered what's available on the radio? OK, locally there's BBC or Independent radio, shared by 2.5 million people. When you consider Manchester as the second largest city in Britain, don't you think it's strange that there isn't more choice?
We're KFM Radio, and outside London, we're the only serious alternative to ILR and BBC Radio. We now have the technical capability to provide a Stockport-based local radio station, broadcasting initially 7 evenings per week for a total of 42 hours.
So, we want two people who are keen to become deeply involved at an early stage with this kind of radio station. If this sounds like you, then write now in your own hand to KFM Radio, Wilmslow, Cheshire, giving brief details of yourself and why you're interested. The address once again, KFM Radio, Wilmslow, Cheshire.
Charlie, who was always known for finding a way, had the bold plan of putting ads in the Stockport Advertiser and Stockport Express, saying that there was a new radio station going on the air and they needed presenters. It wasn't long before Steve Toon replied to one of the ads, and along with Charlie, he became the main face of KFM. Most of the money made by a pirate radio station comes from adverts, so Charlie made some for local businesses and played them on the air. It came to a surprise to most of these businesses, who rang up KFM asking why they were being advertised. The adverts were free to encourage other businesses to call up and advertise as well. The companies who got their initial free adverts didn't complain. Everything seemed to be going well, but things only lasted a week at Bowstones when a local newspaper noticed adverts for staff at this new station and decided to run a double-page spread on KFM. It's still not known to this day how the paper found out that the transmitter was located at Bowstones, but they did, and the site owner wasn't impressed when he found out he was hosting a pirate radio station. He turned the transmitter off and hid the equipment until Charlie and Steve could go up and collect it. On the way back, Charlie spotted Goit Mill in the Stockport town of Marple. Its elevated position was ideal for a radio station, and it wasn't long at all before a 3-element J-beam Yagi was mounted on the roof, and KFM was once again up and running. This came about when Charlie and Steve Toon approached the mill owner and asked if they could install some radio equipment for a taxi company called Toon Taxis. It wasn't long before Paul, one of the brothers who owned the mill, cottoned on to what was really going on, but he was supportive and managed to fob off the numerous GPO visitors who came looking for the station's transmitter during its short time there. The setup at Goit Mill at first consisted of a UHF link receiver and antenna, a VHF FM main transmitter and a 3-element VHF Yagi on the roof. The studio remained at Rayner House. You can see here where the shelf that supported the main VHF transmitter and UHF link transmitter was fixed to the wall. Charlie drove past Rayner House one afternoon and saw a group of GPO men outside armed with direction finding aerials. They'd clearly traced the UHF link, which wasn't hard given the wide open spaces of the UHF band in those days. It was clear that the GPO were onto KFM. It wasn't long before they raided the site at Goit Mill and took the transmitter, but left the aerial in place. Amazingly, Charlie went with another KFM team member called Simon to what is now the McDonald Hotel near Manchester's Piccadilly station. In those days it was a GPO premises, and he marched in and asked for the transmitter back. Miraculously they agreed, and he signed for it and took it back, and of course put it straight back on the air. By now, KFM was growing. They had more adverts, more people, and the station was on 24/7. Everything was broadcast live with no pre-record, unlike the Aquarius days. The station had phone-ins and gave out a number. Charlie modified a phone wired into the mixer and replaced the ringer with an LED, which acted as the studio phone. Amazingly, the number being given out on the air was Steve Toon's landline. During late September, Charlie received reports of interference on KFM's signal. It turned out that the UHF link was being jammed. The jamming was coming over on a weak signal, but it was enough to block out KFM and cause problems. The content of the jamming was strange children's nursery rhymes, gibberish talking and noises, but with the mention of Charlie's name, and it went on and off with no noticeable patterns. Charlie got hold of a UHF receiver, as well as an antenna and field strength meter, and tried to trace the source of the interference. He managed to track the signal to 2 locations, one in Hazel Grove and the other to an office or factory premises near Goit Mill, the location of the transmitter. Charlie had a feeling that the interference, which by this time seemed to be automated, came from either a radio amateur with amateur radio kit or ex-PMR equipment, or even possibly a rogue from the DTI. After all, who would say anything to the DTI if it was them jamming the link? Charlie came up with a brilliant idea to target the jammer by making a 19 kHz detector to detect the pilot tone on the signal between the transmitter and the receiver that formed the UHF link. He put the detector between the audio feed going over to the main transmitter, and it was designed in such a way that when the jammer keyed up and blocked the pilot tone on the signal, it would drop the audio feed and make it appear as though KFM was off the air. The jammer quickly realised what was going on, and he actually phoned the studio one night and passed a message on to Charlie that if he took the pilot tone detector off, he'd limit the interference to short bursts. To this day, it isn't known who the jammer was. The GPO visiting Rayner House and the jamming of the studio to transmitter link meant that Rayner House was no longer viable as a studio location. So, in October of 1984, they moved the studio into this space at the top of these fire escape stairs at Goit Mill. KFM unfortunately suffered its final raid on November the 8th, 1984, and this really spelled the beginning of the end for them as a pirate station. One of their final activities was transmission on medium wave over Christmas of 1984 using an old ex-Royal Navy rack mount transmitter. It weighed a ton and was hoisted into the mill with a long wave aerial coming down from this section of the roof. This was short-lived, however, and the transmitter, which Charlie picked up from Leeds, was left at the mill. KFM never reappeared as a pirate, but Charlie, Steve and the rest of the gang wanted to go down the legal route. Together with a chap called Paul Boone, who ran a magazine for free and independent radio, Charlie went to meetings that were set up as a way of campaigning against the government and independent local radio.
For a time, the session followed an orderly and fairly predictable pattern of moan swapping. Then came the unexpected.
Charles Turner, KFM Radio in Stockport. I think the whole essence of it is...
We're delighted to see you because it didn't appear from the list that we had anybody from, let's put it this way, outside the system.
I mean, the whole point is that the present broadcasting industry is still trying to decide what the listener wants. We could call ourselves a community of interest station. The type of music we play features a lot of new releases. We also feature a lot of local bands actually in the programming and also album tracks. We're just identifying one particular need and fulfilling it. If there was another 9 stations in Manchester, you'd almost certainly have someone trying to do all news, someone doing heavy rock and so on. I see no reason why someone shouldn't say, right, I've got a load of money, I'm into country and western music, I want to do a country and western station. If the thing falls flat on its face, he loses out, doesn't he? It doesn't cost the government or the taxpayer anything.
The ILR were trying to steer towards community radio stations, and campaigners with civil servant backing had suggested community of interest stations. These were, for example, heavy rock or folk music, basically dedicated genre stations. Of course, the ILR didn't want stations covering most of Manchester playing this type of music. In the end, the legislation changed, and KFM applied for and obtained a legal licence, and that is where the station as a pirate went into the history books. Today, there's no trace of KFM at Goyt Mill or Rayner House. During the making of this documentary, we were fortunate enough to speak with Paul, the owner of the mill, who remembered Charlie after all these years. And as for Charlie, well, he played a part in the very early days of the legal incarnation of KFM. He married, had children, and went down a different career path and was never involved in pirate radio again. He was, however, instrumental in the making of this documentary, still lives close by, and we shared a good few pints as he fondly remembered Stockport's KFM.
KFM Radio.
Are you beginning to hear silly voices in your sleep? Are you afraid to pick up the phone in case you find yourself talking to the world on the wireless? Well, hang on to your sanity because here comes KFM Radio. Between 12 and 4, Monday to Friday, as of Monday the 30th of January, I will be...